long before there is a farmer, long before there is a ploughed field, long before anyone thinks of land as something that can be owned, guarded, measured, taxed, inherited, and fought over. There is a small fire burning low among dark stones in a dry landscape east of the Jordan Valley. The night air is cool. The plants around the settlement are not crops yet. The people here are not peasants, not villagers in the later sense, not citizens of any kingdom, not servants of any temple, not subjects of any king. They are foragers, hunters, gatherers, trackers, makers, travellers, observers of wind and seed and hoofprint. Yet beside their fire, crushed grains have been mixed, shaped, and baked into something that looks strangely familiar across 14,000 years, a kind of bread. It is not bread from a wheat field. It is not bread from a granary belonging to a village economy. It is made from wild plants gathered by people who still live before agriculture, before pottery in this region, before the long human bargain with domesticated crops has fully begun. And that is what makes it so unsettling. The story of farming does not begin with a sudden invention. It begins with appetite, memory, habit, patience, repetition, and the quiet realization that certain places in the world can be returned to again and again because the land itself seems to remember. The crumbs that survive from such a place are tiny, blackened, almost absurdly fragile. They look less like the beginning of civilization than the last remains of a forgotten meal. But in the deep history of human life, small things often carry the greatest weight. A charred seed can outlive a palace. A grinding stone can speak more honestly than a king's inscription. A trace of starch caught in a crack can reveal a world that no myth remembers. What survives in the record suggests that the road to farming was not a straight road at all. It was a braided path, crossing valleys, deserts, wetlands, forests, mountains, and coasts. People did not simply wake one morning after the Ice Age and decide to become farmers. They already knew plants intimately. They knew when certain grasses ripened. They knew which roots could be dug in lean seasons, which nuts could be stored, which reeds grew near water, which trees fruited after certain rains, which seeds needed pounding, soaking, roasting, or grinding before they became food. They'd been altering landscapes with fire, movement, selective gathering, and seasonal return long before the first domesticated wheat or rice appeared. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the story waiting here is not simply about food. It is about how the human world slowly changed shape. To stand at the edge of that ancient world, it helps to forget the word revolution for a moment. The phrase agricultural revolution sounds sharp, bright, decisive, like a door swinging open. It suggests a before and an after, as if human beings crossed a line and never looked back. But the archaeological record is less tidy. It shows hesitation. It shows overlap. It shows people harvesting wild grain while still hunting gazelle, experimenting with planting while still gathering nuts, keeping animals close while still depending on wild herds, building seasonal settlements that are neither fully mobile camps nor permanent villages. Scholars still debate exactly how to define the moment when cultivation becomes agriculture, or when management becomes domestication, because the boundary is blurred by generations of small choices. A person cuts wild barley with a flint blade. Another person stores the best heads of grain in a basket lined with plaster or skin. Someone spills seeds near a camp. Someone notices that certain plants return more thickly where people have disturbed the soil. Someone clears brush, perhaps for comfort, perhaps for firewood, perhaps for visibility, and the open ground favours grasses. No one has to understand genetics for selection to begin. The field, long before it is a field, is being invited into existence. The late Ice Age world is not empty, and it is not primitive in the way older stories once imagined. Across Western Asia, North Africa, Europe, and beyond, human beings have already survived enormous climatic swings. They have made stone tools with elegance and precision. They have hunted dangerous animals when they need to, gathered delicate plants when the season offers them, buried their dead in ways that suggest memory and ritual, painted, carved, traded, travelled, and learned landscapes so deeply that a modern map can seem shallow by comparison. Their lives are not easy, but they are not aimless. They are structured by knowledge. A valley is not just a valley, it is a calendar. A marsh is not just wet ground, it is fish, reeds, waterfowl, edible tubers, insects, fuel, baskets, shelter, danger, and return. A stand of wild corn or barley is not just grass, it is a promise that arrives for a short window and then disappears if missed. To live before farming is not to live before intelligence. It is to live in a world where knowledge is carried in bodies, gestures, roots, tools, songs, and habits rather than written records. Around the end of the Pleistocene, that world begins to change in ways no one can fully control. The great ice sheets retreat, sea levels rise, rainfall patterns shift, forests expand in some places and dry grasslands spread in others. Herds move differently. Plants colonize newly opened ground. Human groups, already skilled at adaptation, adjust again. In the broad zone often called the Fertile Crescent, wild cereals grow in dense stands, especially in regions where winter rains feed grasses that can be harvested in large quantities. The people later called Natufians occupy parts of the Levant before agriculture in the strict sense exists. They are famous not because they are the first farmers, but because they complicate the old story. Some Natufian communities become more settled than earlier mobile bands. They build stone structures, use heavy grinding tools, harvest wild grains, collect nuts, hunt gazelle, and create cemeteries that imply strong ties to place. Yet they remain foragers. They are living in a middle world, 1 foot in mobility, 1 foot in return. This is one of the first clues that farming begins not as a simple improvement, but as a change in relationships. Humans begin to bind themselves more tightly to certain landscapes, and those landscapes begin to reward and trap them in equal measure. A mobile group can follow abundance across a wide territory. A more settled group can store food, build more durable shelters, gather in larger numbers, and develop richer connections to a particular place. But staying creates new needs. Stored food must be protected from moisture, animals, insects, and other people. Nearby resources become more important. Waste accumulates. Social tensions can grow. A place that feeds many people can also hold them still. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is suggestive before there are farming villages. There are places people return to so often that the land becomes part of their identity. The surprising thing is that early people may not have been trying to make agriculture at all. They may have been trying to make meals more reliable, gatherings more abundant, rituals more meaningful, or seasonal returns more worthwhile. Bread before farming captures this perfectly. To make bread from wild grain requires effort that is almost comically demanding from a modern point of view. Seeds must be collected at the right moment, cleaned, ground, mixed, and cooked. Wild cereals often hold tightly to their husks. They shatter when ripe, dropping seeds to the ground. They are not yet designed by human selection to wait obediently on the stalk for harvest. And still, people do the work. That means these foods matter. They may matter nutritionally, socially, ritually, or simply because they taste good when transformed by fire and skill. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Hunger alone is too simple. Culture is already present at the hearth. A lesser-known part of the story is that plant use before domestication can be far more sophisticated than the word gathering suggests. Gathering sounds passive, as if people merely pick up what nature drops. But many foraging societies manage abundance. They burn patches to encourage desired plants. They prune, transplant, protect, scatter seeds, harvest selectively, and time their movements to increase future returns. Such practices do not always leave obvious archaeological signatures. A charred seed may survive. A wooden digging stick usually does not. A field of tubers can be used for generations and vanish without a trace that is easy to recognize. This is one reason the earliest histories of agriculture are biased toward grains. Wheat, barley, rice, millet, and maize leave clearer clues: seeds, husks, phytoliths, impressions in clay, residues on tools, roots, yams, taro, bananas, and other vegetatively propagated plants are much harder to catch in the ancient record. The beginning of farming may therefore look grainier to us than it felt to the people who lived it. In this early stage, the human relationship with animals is also changing, though not yet in the familiar barnyard sense. Dogs are already close to humans before the rise of farming, the result of a much older relationship between people and wolves that gradually becomes something new. Other animals remain wild, but human attention sharpens around their movements. Gazelle migrations, wild sheep ranges, boar habitats, aurochs territories, and bird nesting seasons all matter. The same human mind that notices where grain grows thick also notices where animals return, breed, rest, and feed. Later, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle will enter the human-managed world in different ways, in different regions, at different speeds. But here, at the beginning, there is no grand design. There are only repeated encounters, practical decisions, and the slow pressure of proximity. So the first section of this story is not a tale of invention, but of preparation without intention. Humans have already become experts in living with uncertainty. They know abundance can vanish, they know seasons can fail, they know a valley that feeds one generation may dry in another, and yet they also know something else: the world can be coaxed. Not controlled, not yet, but nudged. A stand of wild grain can be revisited, a patch can be cleared, seeds can be stored, a favoured plant can be protected, a settlement can last a little longer than before, a meal can be made from wild grasses, and the memory of that meal can draw people back. In the darkness before the first true fields, the future does not arrive as a revelation. It arrives as crumbs beside a fire, as seeds in a basket, as hands dusted with flour from plants no one has domesticated yet. The agricultural revolution begins, if it can be called a revolution at all, as a whisper repeated for thousands of years. The world that carries those first crumbs of bread is not a stable world. It is a landscape still recovering from ice, still breathing unevenly after tens of thousands of years of cold, dust, hunger, migration, and abrupt change. The great glaciers lie far to the north, but their influence reaches deep into human life. They hold oceans lower than today. They pull moisture from the air. They reshape winds, rivers, coastlines, animal ranges, and the spread of forests and grasses. Then, As the planet warms, everything begins to move. Ice melts, seas rise, rain belts shift, woodlands creep into open country, lakes swell and shrink, herd animals alter their routes, plant communities rearrange themselves like pieces on a board no human being can see whole. For people living through it, the end of the Ice Age is not a date. It is a long series of local surprises. A hillside that once held open grass becomes thick with trees. A wetland appears where dry ground had been. A spring fails. A river changes course. A familiar herd arrives late or not at all. What had been reliable for grandparents may no longer be reliable for grandchildren. This matters because farming does not begin in a vacuum. It begins in the aftershock of climatic transformation. Around 11,700 years ago, the Holocene begins, a warmer and generally more stable period compared with the violent swings of the late Pleistocene. But stability here does not mean stillness. It means that in many regions, the extremes soften enough for people to return more often to the same places, for plant stands to become more predictable, and for larger settlements to remain possible for longer periods. In Southwest Asia, winter rains nourish wild cereals across hills, valleys, and steppe margins. In East Asia, changing monsoon patterns affect river basins and wetlands where wild rice grows. In the highlands of New Guinea, wet tropical environments support tubers and bananas that leave fewer obvious traces but may have been managed early. In Africa, the Sahara is not always the endless desert imagined today. During humid phases, parts of it become greener, holding lakes, grasslands, animals, and eventually pastoral lifeways. The world after the Ice Age is not one stage, but many stages, each with different plants, animals, risks, and invitations. The older story often treated climate like a simple trigger. Ice Age ends, weather improves, humans farm, or drought strikes. Humans are forced to farm. Both versions are too clean. Climate matters profoundly, but it does not act alone. If warmth automatically created farming, then every warm region with useful plants would have become agricultural at the same time. If drought automatically forced farming, then every stressed foraging society would have become farmers. Neither happened. Some groups experimented and intensified plant use. Others remained successful foragers for thousands of years. Some adopted animals but not crops. Some cultivated plants without fully domesticating them. Some encountered farming neighbours and chose only parts of the package. Scholars still debate the balance between environmental pressure, population growth, cultural preference, social gathering, ritual obligation, and sheer historical accident. The evidence remains incomplete because human choices are difficult to fossilize. A climate shift can be recorded in lake sediments, pollen, speleothems, and ice cores. A decision to return to one patch of grass because the last harvest was good is harder to see. Still, climate supplies the stage on which all later choices unfold. In the Levant, the Natufian world sits at the edge of this instability. These communities flourish during a period when wild grasses, nuts, and game can support more settled lifeways in certain favourable zones. Heavy grinding stones appear, along with stone-built structures and cemeteries that suggest deep attachment to place. Then comes the Younger Dryas, beginning around 12,900 years ago, a sudden return to cooler, drier conditions in many areas after a warming trend had already begun. For more than 1,000 years, the climate becomes less forgiving. In some places, wild cereal stands shrink or become less predictable. Woodland patterns shift. Water sources may become more seasonal. Gazelle and other animals adjust to changing vegetation. The Younger Dryas has often been placed at the centre of farming's origin story, almost as if hardship pushed people into cultivation. But no single explanation fully accounts for this. The cold pulse may have intensified experimentation in some communities, encouraging people to manage plants more deliberately. But farming did not simply appear the moment the weather turned bad. The shift was slower, messier, and more regional. One of the lesser-known details of this period is that human beings were not merely reacting to landscapes. They were already part of what landscapes were becoming. Fire, harvesting, trampling, refuse dumping, tool-making, and repeated settlement all changed local ecologies. Around camps and seasonal settlements, soils could become richer from ash, food waste, and human activity. Disturbed ground often favours fast-growing plants, including some of the very grasses and weedy species that later thrive in agricultural settings. Places where people repeatedly cut, gathered, processed, and discarded plants could become small zones of ecological opportunity. These were not fields in the later sense. There were no neat boundaries, no ploughs drawn through long furrows, no written records of ownership. Yet they show how a human place could become different from the land around it. The future of farming may have begun not only in valleys of natural abundance, but also in these disturbed edges where human habit quietly changed the rules. As climates shift, animals also force choices. Large Ice Age mammals disappear from many regions, though the timing and causes vary widely and remain debated. Some extinctions are tied to warming, vegetation change, human hunting pressure, or combinations that differ from place to place. Smaller, faster breeding animals often become more important. In parts of Southwest Asia, gazelle hunting intensifies before agriculture, requiring detailed knowledge of movement and seasonality. Elsewhere, fish, birds, shellfish, and wetland resources support more settled communities. This is important because farming is not born only from plants. It emerges from broader changes in how people schedule life. When a group can count on fish runs, nut harvests, wild grain ripening, migrating animals, and stored foods in the same territory, it becomes easier to stay longer. When staying longer becomes possible, buildings become more worthwhile. When buildings and storage appear, leaving becomes harder. Climate opens and closes these possibilities unevenly. Rivers are especially powerful in this story. A river valley is a corridor, a pantry, a boundary, and a risk. It brings water, fish, fertile silt, reeds, birds, and travel routes. It also floods, cuts banks, breeds insects, and changes course without asking permission. In early agricultural regions, rivers and wetlands often provide the rich mosaic that makes experimentation possible. Along the lower Yangtze, wild rice grows in watery environments shaped by monsoons, wetlands, lakes, and shifting channels. The domestication of rice does not seem to follow a single clean path from wild plant to crop. Some areas show early signs of management, while others continue using wild forms. Some develop more complete waterfield systems only later. The story looks less like a spark and more like a relay, with knowledge, plants, tools, and landscape practices passing unevenly from one place to another. In such settings, farming is not simply planted on the land, it is negotiated with water. The same can be said for dry lands. In the southern Caucasus, in Central Asia, in the margins beyond the classic Fertile Crescent, people interact with wild cereals and early crops in ways that complicate the map. Evidence of wild barley harvesting in what is now Uzbekistan suggests that the habits leading toward agriculture were not confined to one narrow birthplace. Later evidence for bread wheat in the South Caucasus adds another layer. reminding us that the spread and development of cultivated plants involved mountain corridors, local experiments, and regional histories often overshadowed by famous river valleys and textbook centres. The more archaeologists look, the less agriculture appears as a single origin story. It becomes a widening pattern of human attention, sharpened by climate but not dictated by it. By the time the Holocene world settles into its warmer rhythm, people have already been trained by instability. They know that abundance must be timed. They know that movement can save lives, but staying can create new forms of wealth. They know that plants respond to disturbance, that animals follow water and pasture, that rivers give and take, that weather can break old promises. The restless climate does not invent farming on its own. It creates the restless conditions in which farming becomes imaginable. The earth changes, and humans answer not with one decision, but with thousands of repeated acts returning, cutting, storing, clearing, watching, waiting. Out of those acts, the ancient world begins to tilt. The wild landscape remains wild, but in certain places it is no longer entirely outside human hands. To understand how farming begins, it is necessary to step away from the old image of foragers as people merely wandering through nature, taking whatever chance places in front of them. That image is convenient, but it is deeply misleading. The people standing at the edge of agriculture are not waiting for knowledge to arrive. They already live inside knowledge. They know landscapes the way later scribes know archives, the way sailors know currents, the way shepherds know weather before it announces itself. Their world is read through colour, smell, texture, timing, insect movement, bird calls, soil dampness, seed hardness, and the angle of the season. A stand of wild grain is not simply seen, it is judged. Is it ripe enough to cut, or will the heads shatter if touched? Has the rain been strong enough this year? Are rodents already feeding there? Will another group arrive first? Can the seeds be carried back before heat or damp ruins them? These are not minor observations. They are the mental groundwork from which cultivation can slowly emerge. The word gatherer hides a remarkable amount of skill. A gatherer must know not only what is edible, but when it is edible, what part is edible, how it must be prepared, and what happens if preparation is careless. Some plants are nourishing only after pounding, leaching, roasting, grinding, fermenting, or boiling. Some seeds are worth collecting only during a narrow window before they fall. Some roots are easier to dig after rain softens the earth. Some nuts can be stored for long periods, but only if dried properly. Some fruits arrive in abundance and vanish almost immediately. Some grasses look similar but behave differently under harvest. Some bitter or toxic substances can be reduced by processing, turning an unpromising plant into dependable food. None of this is simple. It requires memory across generations, and it requires trust in accumulated practice. Long before agriculture, people have already built a library of plant behaviour, but their library is carried in hands. Scars, paths, tools, and repeated meals. What survives archaeologically is only the harder edge of this knowledge. Stone-grinding slabs, pestles, mortars, sickle blades, storage pits, hearths, charred seeds, phytoliths, starch grains, pollen traces, and plant impressions in mud or clay all give clues. Yet the evidence remains incomplete. Baskets decay. Wooden digging sticks rot. Skin bags disappear. Plant fibres vanish unless conditions are unusually dry, frozen, burned, or waterlogged. A lifetime of skill can leave only a few dark seeds and a worn stone. This is why early plant use is so difficult to reconstruct. The record favours what burns without turning entirely to ash, what mineralizes, what is made of stone, what falls into a protected floor layer, what happens to survive accident and time. For every plant archaeologists can identify, many others may have been used, managed, tasted, rejected, or prized without leaving a clear signature. The ancient diet was probably broader than the surviving evidence suggests. In Southwest Asia, the plants that later become famous are wild cereals, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley, rye, and related grasses. These plants have qualities that make them unusually powerful in human history. They produce dense calories. They grow in seasonal stands. They can be harvested in quantity. Their seeds can be dried and stored. They can be ground into flour, cooked into porridge, shaped into flatbreads, fermented into later drinks, and transported more easily than many fresh foods. But before domestication, they are still wild organisms following their own interests, if one can put it that way. A wild grass benefits when its ripe seed head breaks apart and scatters seed onto the ground. A human harvester benefits when the seed head stays intact long enough to be cut and carried away. At first, this is merely a practical problem. Over many generations, it becomes an evolutionary pressure. Humans prefer plants that are easier to harvest. Plants with tougher stalks or less brittle seed heads are more likely to be gathered, stored, accidentally sown, or deliberately planted. No one needs to intend domestication for domestication to begin. The same practical intelligence appears in the tools. Flint blades used for cutting grasses sometimes develop a distinctive sheen known as sickle gloss, created by repeated contact with silica-rich stems. Such gloss is a small trace of a repeated motion hand, haft, blade, stalk, hand, haft, blade, stalk, across days of harvest under sun and dust. Grinding stones tell another part of the story. They are heavy. A highly mobile group can carry small tools easily. But large grinding slabs encourage return or longer stays. They suggest that certain places are used repeatedly enough to justify leaving weight behind or building life around it. A person who invests in a heavy grinding stone is not just eating wild seed. They're building a relationship with a place where processing food becomes predictable. The tool itself becomes a quiet anchor. Storage changes the world even more. To store food is to argue with time. It means taking a seasonal burst of abundance and stretching it into the future. It also means accepting new problems. Stored grain attracts insects, rodents, birds, moisture, mold, and human attention. It must be guarded, sealed, hidden, elevated, dried, or watched. Storage creates security, but it also creates vulnerability. A family or group with stored food can survive a lean spell better, host gatherings, support ritual events, and stay longer in one place. But stored food can also become a source of tension, obligation, inequality, and desire. The first stores are not banks or taxes, but they contain the seed of later social changes. Once food can accumulate, questions follow: who gathered it, who processed it, who controls it, who may eat it, who must share it, who remembers what is owed. Fire also belongs at the center of this story. Fire cooks food, but it also shapes landscapes. Foragers in many regions use controlled burning to open paths, encourage fresh growth, attract animals, reduce pests, clear old vegetation, and favor useful plants. In deep history, not every burn is visible to archaeologists, and not every charcoal layer can be confidently tied to human intention. Scholars still debate many details, yet the broader principle is clear. People before farming are not living outside ecology. They are ecological actors. A burned patch can bring tender shoots, open ground can favour grasses, ash can change soil chemistry, disturbance can create opportunities for plants that thrive near humans. The future weeds of agriculture may have found some of their earliest advantages around camps, paths, clearings, and repeatedly used places. This is why the beginning of farming looks less like a discovery and more like an intensification of older habits. People already harvest. They simply harvest more often. They already process seeds. They process them in greater quantities. They already return to good places. They return with stronger expectations. They already manage landscapes. They do it more deliberately, or at least more repeatedly. They already understand plant cycles. They begin to intervene in them with greater consequence. At some point, perhaps after a poor season, perhaps after a good one, perhaps for a feast, perhaps for reliability, seeds are put into the ground not only by accident but by intention. Even then, the people who do this may not become full-time farmers. They may plant a little and still hunt, gather, fish, trap, trade, and move. The boundary between wild and cultivated remains porous. A surprising lesson from newer research is that these middle ways may not have been brief transitional mistakes. In some regions, they lasted for centuries or even millennia. People could live with cultivated plants that were not fully domesticated, or with domesticated plants that formed only part of the diet. They could mix wild cereals, pulses, nuts, fruits, tubers, hunted animals, fish, and managed plots in ways that do not fit simple categories. The famous idea of a neat package of founder crops is useful, but too narrow if treated as the whole story. Einkorn, emmer, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, flax, and other early crops matter enormously, yet they do not represent all the plants that fed people or guided experimentation. Many small grasses, fruits, nuts, and local resources likely filled the gaps between what archaeology easily sees and what people actually ate. So the gatherers who stand before farming are not poor versions of farmers. They are experts in a different way of being human. Their genius lies in flexibility. They can move when needed, stay when possible, harvest without owning, store without writing, manage without fences, and alter landscapes without imagining themselves separate from them. Agriculture will eventually narrow some of that flexibility even as it creates new power. It will make food more dependable in some ways and more fragile in others. But before the village fully takes root, before the field becomes the measure of life, there is this older intelligence patient, seasonal, observant, and easily underestimated. The first farmers come from people who already know plants so well that the plants have begun, quietly, to change under their hands. Once people begin returning to the same places with heavier tools, stored foods, and stronger expectations, the landscape changes in a new way. A camp is no longer only a pause in movement, it becomes a remembered place. Stones remain where hands left them. Hearths are rebuilt near older hearths. Paths become worn into the ground. Refuse collects along edges. Burials mark the earth with human meaning. Food processing leaves dust, seeds, ash, bone, and broken tools in repeated layers. A shelter that might once have been temporary is repaired instead of abandoned. The settlement does not yet look like the farming village of later centuries, but it is no longer only a fleeting stop in a seasonal round. It is something stranger and more important, a place where mobility and attachment begin to overlap. In Southwest Asia, this in-between world becomes especially visible. The Natufian communities of the Levant, living before the full domestication of crops, show how a foraging society can become deeply tied to particular landscapes. Some Natufian sites contain stone-built structures, ground stone tools, storage features, ornaments, art objects, and cemeteries. They harvest wild cereals and process plant foods in large quantities, but they still hunt, gather, and move in ways that separate them from later agricultural villages. Their world is not a simple preview of farming, because they are not merely waiting to become farmers. They are living successfully in their own system, one built around rich seasonal resources, social gathering, and repeated use of favoured places. What survives in the record suggests that sedentism does not always follow farming. Sometimes, partial sedentism comes first, and farming follows later. This reversal matters. The common story imagines people planting crops, producing surplus, and then settling down. But in some regions, people may have settled more firmly because wild resources were abundant enough to make staying possible. Wild grain fields, nut-bearing trees, gazelle herds, wetland resources, and predictable water sources could support larger communities for longer periods. Once people stay, their needs change. They need more fuel near home. They need more reliable food close by. They need places to store harvests. They need ways to manage waste, repair structures, maintain relationships, and organize labor. Staying creates both comfort and pressure. A group that returns to a good place occasionally can leave when resources thin. A group that has built houses, buried relatives, stored food, and formed social obligations may find leaving more difficult. The settlement begins as an opportunity, but it can become a commitment. The first semi-settled communities therefore occupy a delicate position. They have not yet surrendered entirely to the field, but they are already carrying some of the burdens that later farmers know well. Food storage is one of the strongest signs of this change. A mobile group can dry meat, carry seeds, cache nuts, or preserve certain foods, but larger fixed stores tie people to place. Storage pits, baskets, containers, and protected spaces allow food to last beyond its season. This can make life more secure, especially when weather turns harsh or when a gathering brings many people together. Yet stored food is also a magnet for trouble. Rodents learn quickly. Insects arrive unseen. Dampness spoils grain. Other people may notice abundance. A store of food is a promise to the future, but it is also a visible concentration of value. Long before coins, fields, or written accounts, stored calories create a new kind of wealth. Architecture deepens that change. A stone wall does not have to be monumental to alter human life. Even a modest structure changes how people think about return. It creates an inside and outside. It makes certain activities repeat in certain places. It shelters tools too heavy to carry far. It encourages repair, cleaning, rebuilding, and memory. In some early settlements, houses or hut-like structures are rebuilt over time, sometimes on similar footprints, turning architecture into a record of persistence. The floor beneath the living becomes an archive of meals, craft, sleep, work, and ritual. The roof may be perishable and vanish from archaeology, but post holes, wall stones, plaster, packed floors, and hearths remain. Scholars still debate how permanent some of these settlements really were, because a place used intensely for part of the year can sometimes resemble a year-round village in the archaeological record. But whether fully permanent or seasonal, the pattern is clear: humans are investing more heavily in place. There is also a social side to this investment that can be easy to miss. A larger or more settled community must manage relationships differently from a small mobile band. People encounter one another more often. Resources are shared, claimed, remembered, or disputed. Work can be coordinated across seasons. Feasts may become more important, not only as meals but as events that bind people together, settle obligations, and display generosity. The preparation of grain-based foods, including early breads or porridges, may have mattered as much socially as nutritionally. Grinding wild cereals takes time. Gathering enough seed for a group event takes planning. Cooking for many people transforms plant knowledge into social power. No single explanation fully accounts for why people intensified wild grain use, but it is plausible that food became part of gathering, ritual, alliance, and identity long before it became the foundation of taxation and states. A surprising detail from this world is how heavy some of its tools are. Ground stone mortars, grinding slabs, and large pestles are not objects made for constant travel. They belong to places, or at least to routes where people expect to return. Their weight tells a quiet story of confidence. A group that leaves a heavy tool behind is trusting that the place will matter again. It is a small act of settlement without full settlement, a promise made in stone. In this sense, the first sedentary experiments may not have required a complete break with older mobility. People could still move through landscapes while anchoring parts of their lives at reliable points. The world becomes a network of remembered places rather than a single permanent home. Human activity also begins altering the local environment around these settlements. Fuel collection can thin nearby wood. Repeated trampling hardens ground. Waste enriches soils in some areas and attracts animals in others. Seeds dropped during processing may sprout near habitation zones. Disturbed soils favor plants that grow quickly and tolerate human presence. Some of these plants are useful, others are weeds that later become inseparable from farming. The line between wild stand and human influence patch becomes hard to draw. People may clear space for practical reasons and unintentionally encourage edible grasses. They may discard seeds and later notice new growth. They may protect useful plants from being trampled or eaten. They may burn old vegetation and find that new shoots return in abundance. The evidence remains incomplete. But these are exactly the kinds of small repeated actions through which landscapes become partly domesticated before crops fully are. This does not mean early sedentism is always comfortable or inevitable. More people living closer together can create sanitation problems. Refuse accumulates. Parasites and pests find opportunity. Smoke lingers near structures. Social friction may rise. Local resources can be depleted if too many people stay too long. The very success of a good settlement can make it vulnerable. It attracts humans, animals, insects, and obligations. It asks more of the surrounding land year after year. In this tension, one can feel the future pressing in. The settlement solves old problems of mobility and seasonality, but it creates new problems of density and dependence. Farming will later answer some of these pressures by producing more food nearby, yet it will also intensify them. So the first sedentary experiments are not merely the first steps towards civilization. They are a profound change in the human sense of place. People begin to live with the dead nearby, with stored food under protection, with tools too heavy to wander, with buildings that remember earlier buildings, with landscapes subtly altered by repeated use. They are not yet farmers in the full sense, but they have crossed into a world where return matters more than departure. And once return becomes a habit, The seeds gathered from the hills and valleys no longer belong only to the wild season in which they ripen. They become part of a human schedule, a human memory, a human future. Somewhere in that slow binding of people to place, the village is already waiting. The small seeds at the centre of this story do not look powerful. A wild grain head, dry and brittle in the hand, seems almost too slight to carry the weight of human history. It is not a mammoth, not a carved monument, not a city wall, not a crown, not a bronze sword lifted in the sun. It is a cluster of tiny edible bodies held on a stem for a brief moment before the plant releases them back into the soil. Yet these seeds contain an unusual kind of promise. They are compact, storable, numerous, and patient. They can sleep through dry months. They can be gathered by the basketful when conditions are right. They can be ground into flour, boiled into porridge, baked into flat cakes, mixed with other plants, and carried across distance. They do not rot as quickly as fresh meat or fruit if dried properly. They can become food now, food later, and eventually seed for the next season. Long before anyone writes laws about land or builds granaries for kings, wild cereals offer something rare in the ancient world, a way to hold a piece of summer against the uncertainty of winter. In the hills and steppe margins of southwest Asia, wild wheat and barley grow in dense stands where rain, soil, slope, and season allow them to flourish. Einkorn, emmer, barley, and related grasses are not yet domesticated crops, but they already possess traits that make them attractive to human hands. Their seeds are calorie-rich, their harvest can be scheduled, their processing is laborious, but the reward is substantial. A band of foragers who finds a thick patch at the right moment can collect food in quantities that change what is possible for the weeks ahead. The grain can be dried, it can be stored, it can feed a gathering, it can support a longer stay near a favoured place. It can turn a good valley into a place worth remembering. What survives in the record suggests that these plants did not become important because they were easy. They became important because they were dependable enough to repay effort. There is a hidden drama in the harvest itself. Wild cereals are not obedient. When ripe, many wild grasses shatter, meaning the seed-bearing parts break apart and scatter. This is good for the plant, because it spreads seed across the ground. It is inconvenient for a human harvester, because the food disappears at exactly the moment it becomes ready. Timing is everything. Cut too early, and the grains may be immature. Wait too long, and much of the crop falls away. People who harvest wild cereals must learn the brief season of readiness with precision. They may cut with flint blades set into handles, strip seeds by hand, beat seed heads into baskets, or gather fallen grain from the ground. Different techniques leave different traces, and scholars still debate how common each method was in different periods and regions. But the repeated act matters more than any single tool. Harvesting teaches people to watch grass not as background, but as a living calendar. A surprising detail is that the earliest importance of cereals may not have been purely about survival. Grain foods can be ordinary, but they can also be special. A porridge prepared for a cold day, a flatbread made for a gathering, a fermented drink shared during ritual or celebration, a store of seeds opened when other foods are scarce. All of these possibilities give grain a social life. The discovery of bread-like remains before farming makes this difficult to ignore. To turn wild cereals into bread requires gathering, cleaning, grinding, mixing, and cooking. It is not the quickest path to calories. It suggests taste, tradition, skill, and perhaps occasions when food is meant to do more than fill the body. No single explanation fully accounts for why certain communities invested so much labour in wild grain. but it is likely that grain became valuable because it could feed both hunger and belonging. As grain becomes more central, the settlement changes around it. Heavy grinding stones become more common in places where cereals are processed repeatedly. Storage facilities become more valuable. Hearths, work areas, and floors accumulate plant residues. The rhythm of the year begins to bend around ripening grasses. People may still hunt, gather fruits, collect nuts, dig roots, fish, and travel. But the grain harvest creates a seasonal gravity. A community that expects a harvest must be near the stands when the time comes. A group that stores grain must decide where to keep it. A family that relies on stored seed must protect it. A place that has grinding tools and storage pits becomes easier to return to than to abandon. The seeds do not chain people to the land all at once. They tug, season after season, until movement itself begins to reorganize. The biological relationship between humans and cereals deepens slowly. At first, humans are harvesting wild plants. Over time, their choices begin to favor certain traits. Plants with tougher rachises, meaning seed heads that do not break apart as easily, are more convenient for harvest. Plants with larger seeds may be preferred. Plants growing near camps or in disturbed soils may be gathered more often. Seeds stored by humans may be spilled or planted, intentionally or not, in places shaped by human activity. If people begin sowing some of what they gather, even in small plots, selection intensifies. The wild plant is still wild, but it is living under a new pressure. Its success increasingly depends on human behavior. This is one of the strangest turns in deep history. People try to secure food, and in the process they become agents in the evolution of other species. Barley shows why these grasses matter so much. It is hardy, flexible, and able to grow in environments where other crops struggle. Later in history, barley will become a staple across drylands, highlands, and marginal zones, useful for food, fodder, and brewing. But its earlier story begins with wild stands and human attention. Wheat has its own complexity. Einkorn and emmer have deep roots in early Southwest Asian agriculture, while later bread wheat carries a more tangled history, involving hybridization and movement across regions. Newer discoveries in places such as the South Caucasus remind us that the history of wheat is not confined to one neat birthplace. It spreads, changes, crosses ecological zones, and becomes part of local experiments. Rye, too, complicates the picture. In some early context, it appears as a gathered or cultivated plant before becoming a major crop in colder regions much later. The famous cereals are not a single package dropped into human life. They are separate biographies that become entangled. The focus on wheat and barley can also mislead if it becomes too narrow. Early people did not live by cereals alone. Lentils, peas, veggies, nuts, fruits, small seeds, tubers, wild greens, and animal foods all mattered. Some plants that were crucial locally may be nearly invisible archaeologically. Others may appear briefly and then fade from importance. The old idea of a small fixed set of founder crops captures part of the Southwest Asian story, but the evidence increasingly suggests a broader and more flexible plant world. Some species were cultivated and abandoned, some remained wild but heavily used, some became weeds in human-disturbed ground before later becoming useful. Agriculture grew not from one chosen seed, but from a messy garden of possibilities, only some of which became famous. Still, wild grain holds a special position because it changes time. A berry harvest is brief. A hunted animal must be consumed, dried, shared, or moved quickly. Many roots and greens are seasonal and local. Grain, once dried, waits. It can be counted by volume, hidden in pits, poured from baskets, rationed through lean months, exchanged, saved for feasts, and eventually withheld or claimed. This quality reshapes imagination. The future becomes something that can be stored. Risk becomes something that can be managed, though never eliminated. The community can grow larger because calories can be accumulated, but with accumulation comes dependence. If a group builds more of its life around grain, a failed harvest matters more. If more people gather near reliable cereals, pressure on the landscape rises. The treasure is also a trap, though it takes generations to recognize its full shape. By the time wild grain begins to dominate certain human routines, the ancient world has changed in a way that cannot easily be reversed. The grasslands are no longer just places animals graze and seeds fall unseen. They are watched, they are timed, they are entered with blades, baskets, and memory. Their harvest draws people together, anchors tools, fills stores, feeds experiments, and encourages the first hesitant acts of planting. The seed remains small, but its influence spreads outward into shelter, labour, settlement, social obligation, and the human sense of tomorrow. In these dry stems and hard kernels lies one of history's quietest powers, the ability to make people stay. Then the weather turns against the old rhythm, not everywhere in the same way, not with a single dramatic storm that announces itself across the world, but with a long, cold hesitation in the planet's recovery from the Ice Age. After a period of warming, after plants and animals have begun shifting into new patterns, after some human communities have grown more settled and more confident in the richness of certain valleys and hills, the climate abruptly cools again. The period later called the Younger Dryas begins around 12,900 years ago and lasts for more than 1,000 years. For the people living through it, there is no name for it. There is only the experience of changed seasons, harsher dryness in many places, altered plant communities, less predictable harvests, and the uneasy feeling that familiar landscapes no longer keep their promises. In the Levant and neighbouring regions, this matters deeply because the communities already tied to wild cereals and semi-settled life now face a difficult contradiction. Their way of life has become richer, but also less flexible. Earlier mobile foragers can move widely when resources fail, following animals, fruits, nuts, water, and seasonal abundance across broad territories. More settled groups can still move, but they're no longer moving in quite the same way. They have heavy grinding stones, built structures, stored foods, cemeteries, remembered places, and social ties rooted in particular landscapes. They have invested in return. When the climate grows colder and drier, when stands of wild grain become less dependable in some areas, when water and game shift, that investment becomes both strength and burden. People who have learned to stay must now learn how to make staying possible under worse conditions. This is why the Younger Dryas has often been treated as one of the great suspects in the origin of agriculture. It seems, at first glance, almost too fitting. Communities rely more heavily on wild cereals. Climate stress reduces the reliability of those cereals. People respond by planting, tending, and managing them more deliberately. From pressure comes cultivation, and from cultivation comes farming. It is a neat story, and like many neat stories, it contains something plausible but not enough. Scholars still debate how decisive the Younger Dryas really was. The cold, dry interval may have accelerated experimentation in some places, but it did not create farming by itself. Farming did not appear everywhere the Younger Dryas was felt, nor did all communities under stress choose cultivation. Some moved, some changed hunting strategies, some intensified gathering, some relied more on wetlands, nuts, fish, or trade. Human responses to climate are rarely automatic. The weather narrows possibilities, but culture, memory, population, landscape, and chance decide which paths remain open. At certain sites, however, the pressure becomes visible in ways that are hard to ignore. In parts of Southwest Asia, archaeologists find evidence for intensified use of cereals and other plant foods during and after this climatic disruption. Grinding tools, storage, settlement remains, and plant assemblages suggest that people are experimenting with ways to stabilize food supply. Abu Huraira, on the Euphrates, is often discussed in this context because it preserves signs of changing plant use through the transition from foraging into cultivation and later farming. The details are complex, and the evidence has been interpreted in more than one way. But the broader pattern is powerful people living at the edge of environmental change begin relying more heavily on plants that can be gathered, stored, and eventually cultivated. The shift is not a single moment of invention. It is a tightening relationship under stress. One of the most important things to understand is that stress alone does not make agriculture attractive unless people already possess the knowledge needed to respond. The community affected by the Younger Dryas are not helpless victims of weather. They already know cereals. They know how to harvest them, process them, store them, cook them, and return to places where they grow. They have tools suited to the work. They have traditions of plant use. They have settlements where food storage and processing are already meaningful. Climate stress does not teach them from nothing. It pushes existing skills into new intensity. A wild stand that once seemed generous may now need encouragement. A patch near a settlement may be worth protecting. Seeds once gathered only from wild growth may be deliberately scattered or sown. Plants that survive near human disturbance may receive more attention. What begins as risk management can slowly become cultivation. There is a subtle human drama here, because the people making these choices may not see themselves as crossing a threshold. A group may plant a small amount of grain while still gathering wild foods. Another may tend certain stands without thinking of them as crops. Another may store more seed than before, or return earlier in the season, or clear competing plants from a patch that has been useful in the past. A poor year may make these efforts feel necessary. A good year may make them feel successful. Over generations, the memory of what worked becomes tradition. Tradition becomes expectation. Expectation becomes obligation. Eventually, the community may depend on a practice that began as an experiment. This is one reason agriculture can feel both voluntary and forced. No one needs to choose the entire future all at once. Each generation accepts only the next practical step, and the steps accumulate behind them. The Younger Dryas also reveals the danger of imagining nature and culture as separate forces. Climate affects plant growth, but human settlement affects plant communities too. Around semi-permanent sites, soils are disturbed, enriched, trampled, burned, and cleared. These conditions can favor the very species that later become crops or agricultural companions. During a period of environmental stress, such human-shaped patches may become even more important. A naturally dense stand of wild grain might shrink, while a disturbed area near people produces plants that are easier to monitor. The boundary between coping with climate and creating a new ecological niche becomes blurred. Farming, in this sense, is not merely humanity conquering nature. It is humans and certain plants entering a strange alliance under pressure. Yet the cold event also reminds us how much is missing from the record. We do not have the thoughts of the people who first sowed seeds with intention. We do not know whether they saw planting as ordinary extension of gathering, ritual care for a valued plant, emergency strategy, seasonal insurance, or something else entirely. We do not know how often early attempts failed. We rarely see the abandoned experiments, the patches that did not grow, the stored seeds ruined by damp, the settlements that could not endure, the plants managed for a few generations and then forgotten. Archaeology preserves success unevenly and failure poorly. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness matters because the path to farming was almost certainly filled with false starts. By the end of the Younger Dryas, the world warms again into the Holocene. Conditions improve in many regions, and this renewed stability may have helped cultivation expand. This is one of the great ironies of the story. Climate stress may have pushed some communities to experiment more intensely, but a more stable climate may have allowed those experiments to flourish. Hardship may have opened the door, but stability made it easier to walk through. In the early Holocene, settlements grow, cultivation spreads, and the first clearer signs of domesticated plants begin to emerge. The wild grasses that once demanded perfect timing are slowly transformed into crops more willing to wait for human harvest. The pressure of the Younger Dryas has not invented agriculture by itself, but it may have tightened the knot between people, place, and plant until the older foraging world could no longer return unchanged. So the Younger Dryas should not be imagined as a single villain, a climatic hammer striking humanity into farming. It is better understood as a long, cold interruption at exactly the wrong moment, arriving when some communities have already begun to settle, store, grind, gather, and depend on wild grain. It exposes the fragility of abundance. It makes reliability more valuable. It rewards memory, experimentation, and control, however partial that control remains. In its dry winds and shortened seasons, one can hear the ancient pressure behind a new way of life. The field is still not fully born, but the old landscape has become less forgiving, and human hands begin to answer with seeds. The first domesticated plants do not announce themselves with a boundary line. There is no moment when a wild stand of grain suddenly becomes a crop in the way a gate opens or a fire catches. The change is slower and stranger than that, because it happens inside the bodies of plants while humans are mostly trying to solve ordinary problems. They want food that can be gathered more efficiently, stored more safely, processed more easily, and found again when the season turns. They cut seed heads, carry baskets, sweep floors, spill grain near houses, burn brush, clear patches, save seed, favour larger kernels, and return to places where last year's harvest was good. Over time, these actions begin to sort the plant world. Some plants are ignored, some are eaten and vanish. Some are gathered more often because they suit human hands. Some survive because they grow in disturbed soil around settlements. Some are planted deliberately or by accident, in places no wild seed would have chosen on its own. Domestication begins in this quiet sorting. One of the most important traits in early cereal domestication is almost invisible unless one knows where to look. In many wild grasses, the seed head shatters when ripe. The plant is designed by evolution to scatter its offspring. This works beautifully for the grass and badly for the harvester. A ripe stand may look full in the morning and be half empty after wind, birds, grazing animals, or a touch at the wrong moment. But within any wild population, there can be variation. A few plants hold their seed heads more tightly. In a purely wild setting, those plants may be less successful because their seeds do not disperse as easily. In a human setting, they become more likely to be harvested. If people cut plants and carry them away, then seeds from non-shattering plants are more likely to end up in storage, in refuse, in prepared ground, or in the next sowing. A trait that might be disadvantageous in the wild becomes useful under human attention. This is not magic. It is selection, unfolding grain by grain. The same process affects seed size, germination timing, plant height, husk toughness, and many other traits. Early farmers, or rather the people becoming farmers, may not understand these changes as heredity. They do not need to. They can notice that some plants are better. Some grains grind more easily. Some ripen together. Some survive storage. Some produce more food. Some are less troublesome to harvest. Human preference becomes a force in the landscape. The plants that fit human routines are more likely to be carried forward, while the plants that remain too wild for those routines become less central. What survives in the record suggests that this process takes a long time. In some early cultivation systems, plants are grown by humans for many generations before they show the full package of traits archaeologists call domestication. Cultivation and domestication are related, but they are not the same thing. People can cultivate wild plants. Plants can be partly domesticated before farming dominates life. The categories blur because the past itself was blurred. This is why the phrase pre-domestication cultivation matters so much. It describes a world in which humans are planting, tending, or encouraging plants that remain biologically wild in important ways. For a long time, people may be managing stands without fully transforming them. They may be collecting seed from wild and tended patches at the same time. They may sow some seed near a settlement while still relying on wild harvest from hillsides or wetlands. They may experiment in one valley and abandon the practice in another. In Southwest Asia, the transition from wild plant use to fully domesticated cereals is not instantaneous. It unfolds across centuries and millennia, with different plants changing at different speeds. Scholars still debate exactly how fast certain traits spread and how much early cultivation was intentional. But the broader lesson is clear: domestication is not simply the moment humans control plants. It is the long period when plants and humans become mutually dependent without anyone fully seeing the bargain. A surprising detail is that early domestication may have required humans to work against the grain of older foraging wisdom. A skilled gatherer values diversity. Different foods reduce risk. If one plant fails, another may ripen. If one valley dries, another may offer nuts, roots, animals, fish, or fruit. Agriculture narrows attention. It encourages people to invest heavily in a smaller group of species. This can make food more abundant, but it also makes failure more dangerous. The shift toward domesticated cereals is therefore not simply a story of progress. It is a story of increasing commitment. Once people begin saving seed for future planting, they are no longer only eating the present. They are withholding food from the mouth in order to feed a season that has not yet arrived. That is an extraordinary act of trust in the future, and also an extraordinary risk. The tools of this transformation are ordinary, almost humble: a flint sickle, a grinding stone, a storage pit, a digging stick, a basket, a hearth, a patch of cleared ground. None of these objects alone creates farming. Together, repeated over generations, they change the world. The sickle selects for plants that remain harvestable. The grinding stone makes hard seeds desirable. The storage pit rewards grains that dry well and last long. The cleared patch gives certain plants a protected space. The basket carries seed farther than wind would have carried it. The hearth changes taste and digestibility, making labor-intensive plants worthwhile. Even refuse matters. Seeds thrown out near settlements may sprout in enriched soil, turning waste into experiment. A village edge can become a nursery without ever being named one. The relationship is especially visible in cereals, but the same broad principle applies elsewhere in different forms. In China, rice domestication follows a more watery path. Wild rice grows in wetlands, floodplains, and lake margins, where human intervention involves not only seed selection but water management, harvesting tools, field preparation, and eventually paddy systems. The process varies by region. Some places show signs of early rice management while others continue using wild rice. Some develop more intensive wetfield agriculture later. It is not a single straight line. In New Guinea and Island, Southeast Asia, early plant management may involve tubers, bananas, taro, yams, and other crops that do not behave like cereals and do not always leave neat seed evidence. In Mesoamerica, maize begins as a transformed grass from teosinte, but its rise to dependence is long and complex. Around the world, domestication follows the biology of each plant and the habits of each society. There is no universal script. The plants themselves also change human bodies and schedules. Grain agriculture demands repeated labor clearing, sowing, weeding, guarding, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, grinding, cooking, storing. Some of this work is seasonal and intense, some returns daily. A wild harvest may be opportunistic, but a planted crop imposes expectation. It must be watched. It must be protected from animals, weather, and competing plants. People begin living by the needs of species that once lived without them. The more successful the crop becomes, the more it reorganizes human time. A field is not only a food source, it is a calendar with roots. No single generation needs to understand the full consequence. That may be the deepest mystery of agricultural origins. The people whose hands change the plants are not trying to build cities, invent states, create taxation, support armies, or transform the planet's atmosphere. They are trying to eat, gather, return, survive dry years, feed kin and guests, honor customs, and make tomorrow less uncertain. Yet the plants answer in their own slow way. Their seeds grow larger. Their stalks hold longer. Their timing shifts toward human harvest. Their wild independence weakens. And as the plants become more dependent on people, people become more dependent on them. The domesticated crop is not a passive invention. It is a partner in a long entanglement, one that begins with hands cutting wild grasses and ends with human history rooted in soil. While seeds are being gathered, stored, planted, and slowly changed by human hands, another transformation is unfolding at the edge of the firelight. It begins not in fields, but in attention. Humans have always watched animals closely because survival depends on it. Tracks in damp soil, broken twigs, dung, nesting places, grazing routes, rutting seasons, watering points, alarm calls, hoof marks near a spring, the sudden silence of birds. All of these are part of the ancient language of animal presence. Before herding exists, before corrals, before milk, wool, ploughs, and sacrifice. People already know the movements of wild creatures with a precision that later urban life will mostly forget. Domestication does not begin when humans first notice animals. It begins when certain animals enter a relationship with human settlements so persistent that their futures begin to change. The oldest and strangest of these relationships is the one between humans and dogs. Dogs are already close to people before agriculture becomes a dominant way of life. Their origin lies deeper in time, in the gradual transformation of some wolves into animals able to live near human groups. The details remain debated: where it happened, how many times, how much was driven by wolves scavenging near camps, how much by human tolerance or active care. But the broad truth is clear enough. Dogs are not a product of farming. They're companions from the older foraging world, born from proximity, mutual advantage, and long familiarity. They may help with hunting, warning, tracking, protection, transport in some later contexts, and social life. Their presence shows that humans had already crossed one threshold before fields. They had learned that another species could live alongside them not merely as prey, but as partner. That earlier partnership matters because the domestication of herd animals is often imagined too simply. It can sound as if humans captured wild sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, put them behind fences, and invented livestock. The real process is slower and less tidy. Wild animals do not become domestic because humans want them to. They must have traits that make management possible. They must tolerate human presence to some degree, breed under conditions humans can influence, feed in ways humans can support, and live in social structures that can be redirected. Many animals are useful to humans but never domesticated in the full sense. Gazelle, deer, and many wild cattle can be hunted skillfully for thousands of years without becoming manageable livestock. The animals that enter the Neolithic world are not simply the most delicious or impressive. They are the ones whose biology allows a new kind of relationship. In Southwest Asia, sheep and goats become central to that relationship. Their wild ancestors live in rugged landscapes, moving through hills and uplands where human hunters have long known them. At first, people hunt them. Then, in some places, the kill patterns begin to change. Archaeologists can sometimes detect management not from a written record, but from bones, the ages and sexes of animals killed, the size and shape of bones over time, the presence of animals outside their original wild ranges, and the marks of butchery or enclosure. If people are managing a herd, they may keep more breeding females alive and cull young males. Such patterns differ from ordinary hunting. They suggest that humans are no longer taking animals only as they encounter them in the wild. They are beginning to shape the living population. This is one of the quietest revolutions in the entire agricultural story. A hunted animal is part of the wild schedule. A managed animal becomes part of the human schedule. It must be watched, protected, moved, fed, contained, bred, and sometimes defended from predators or theft. It can turn grass and scrub that humans cannot eat into meat, hides, bone, horn, milk, and eventually wool. It can move with people across landscapes, carrying value on the hoof. It can reproduce, making wealth alive. But it also creates new obligations. Animals need water in dry seasons. They can damage crops. They can spread disease. They can intensify conflict over pasture. They make noise, attract predators, and require knowledge that differs from hunting knowledge. Herding is not simply owning animals, it is entering their needs. Goats may have been especially suited to early management because they are flexible browsers, able to feed on shrubs, leaves, and rough vegetation in environments where crops alone might fail. Sheep, too, become deeply important, though their later identity as wool-bearing animals develops through additional selection over time. The first domestic sheep are not the fluffy creatures of later pastoral landscapes. Their value initially lies more in meat, hides, and manageable herds. Ancient DNA has made this picture more complex. showing that the ancestry of domestic sheep is not a single clean line from one wild population into one domestic flock. It is more like a mosaic, with different wild sources and later movements contributing to the animals that spread with Neolithic lifeways. What survives in the record suggests not one perfect act of domestication, but repeated contact, movement, mixing, and selection. Pigs follow a different path. Unlike sheep and goats, pigs are not animals of open pasture in quite the same way. Wild boar thrive in woodland edges, wetlands, and areas rich in roots, nuts, and refuse. They are intelligent, adaptable, and sometimes dangerous. They are also drawn to human waste, around settlements, where scraps accumulate and disturbed environments grow. Pigs may begin as opportunists at the edge of human life. Human management can intensify from that contact. Pigs reproduce quickly and convert leftovers into meat efficiently, but they are also difficult to herd over long distances compared with sheep and goats. Their domestication history differs by region, and in some places domestic pigs mix repeatedly with wild boar. This again breaks the illusion of a simple package. Animals enter human life through their own ecological doors. Cattle are another matter entirely. Their wild ancestors, aurochs, are powerful animals, large, dangerous, and impressive enough to haunt human imagination long before full domestication. Managing cattle requires a different level of control and risk. Yet the rewards are enormous. Cattle provide meat, hides, blood in some later herding cultures, milk once dairying develops, traction for ploughs and carts in later periods, and immense social value. Their domestication is not just an economic event. It becomes symbolic. Large animals become wealth, status, offering, inheritance, and power. But in the beginning, the transition from hunting aurochs to managing cattle must have been difficult, uneven, and probably regionally varied. Scholars still debate the details of how quickly cattle were controlled and how domestic herds spread. What is clear is that once large livestock enter human systems, they alter landscapes at a scale small animals cannot. Animal domestication also changes human mobility. Crops encourage people to stay near fields, but herds can pull them across land. Early farming and herding are therefore not always the same lifestyle. Some communities focus more heavily on crops. Others mix cultivation with herding. Others become pastoralists, moving animals through seasonal routes while exchanging with settled farmers, in the Green Sahara, for example. Pastoral lifeways spread across landscapes that are hard to reconcile with today's desert image. Lakes, grasslands, and animals support communities whose relationship with cattle and other livestock becomes central. Ancient DNA suggests that in some regions, herding can spread more through cultural adoption than massive population replacement. While in other regions migration plays a stronger role, no single explanation fully accounts for how livestock lifeways moved, because the answer differs from place to place. The presence of animals near settlements also brings a shadow. Living close to livestock increases the chances of disease transmission over long periods, especially as communities become larger and more permanent. Dung, parasites, insects, contaminated water, and close contact create new health challenges. This does not mean early farmers immediately suffer the full burden of later epidemic diseases, which require particular population sizes and conditions. But the foundations are being laid. The same animals that provide security can also bring risk. The same herds that create wealth can create inequality. A crop store can be counted, but a herd can walk, multiply, be raided, gifted, sacrificed, exchanged, or inherited. Livestock make value mobile and visible. So at the edge of the early village, the firelight falls on more than human faces and drying grain. It falls on dogs already at home in human company, on goats and sheep beginning to live under watch, on pigs drawn to settlement edges, on cattle whose power will one day reshape labour and status. The agricultural revolution is not only a plant story, it is an animal story, a story of proximity becoming dependence, hunting knowledge becoming management, wild movement becoming herd rhythm. Humans do not simply domesticate animals, they create new worlds with them, and those animals, in return, domesticate human time, human movement, human wealth, and human imagination. Once plants and animals begin to enter the human orbit more tightly, the settlement changes from a place of return into a place of belonging. The difference is subtle at first. A few more structures remain standing between seasons. A storage pit is lined more carefully. A wall is repaired rather than replaced somewhere else. A grinding stone stays where it is because everyone expects to need it again. Paths deepen between houses, hearths, work areas, refuse zones, and burial places. Dogs sleep near human activity. Goats or sheep may be kept close enough to watch. Seeds are dried, sorted, guarded, and saved. The village does not arrive in one morning like a finished invention. It takes root the way a plant does, slowly, through hidden attachments beneath the surface. The earliest farming villages are not cities, and they're not yet the organized states that later dominate ancient history. There are no kings in the first mud brick houses, no tax officials measuring grain, no armies marching from palace gates. Yet something has changed that will eventually make all of those things possible. More people can live closer together for longer periods, food can be accumulated, labour can be coordinated around seasons, buildings can be planned with future use in mind. The dead can remain physically near the living, tying memory to place. A household can become more than a group of people. It can become a structure, a storage system, a set of rights, an inheritance of tools, obligations, and remembered work. What survives in the record suggests that the village is not just an architectural development, it is a new social organism. In Southwest Asia, early Neolithic settlements show this change with remarkable force. Houses are built from mud brick, stone, timber, reed, plaster, and other local materials. Floors may be carefully prepared, walls are rebuilt, roofs shelter work and sleep. Food processing takes place in repeated locations. Storage becomes increasingly important. Some communities cluster houses tightly together, creating dense built environments where movement itself must be negotiated. In later famous sites such as Çatalhöyük, people live in close-packed houses entered from above, surrounded by wall paintings, burials beneath floors, and symbolic life woven into domestic space. Çatalhöyük comes after the earlier steps of farming, but it reveals where the village path can lead into a world where home, ritual, food, memory, and social identity are no longer separate. The early village intensifies work. Farming is sometimes imagined as a clever escape from the uncertainty of hunting and gathering, but for many people it likely means more labour, not less. Fields or garden plots must be prepared, seeds must be selected and sown, young plants must be protected from birds, grazing animals, weeds, drought, flood, and accident. Harvest comes with urgency, because a crop can be ruined if the timing is wrong. Grain must be cut, carried, threshed, winnowed, dried, stored, ground, and cooked. Animals must be watched, moved, watered, fed, and protected. Houses must be repaired, tools must be maintained, Fuel must be gathered from increasingly pressured surroundings. The village promises continuity, but it demands routine. It gives the future a shape, and then asks people to live inside that shape. That routine changes the body. Repeated grinding can leave marks on bones and joints. Carrying loads, kneeling, squatting, digging, harvesting, and processing grain-shaped muscles and skeletons over years. Diets may narrow as staple crops become more important. In some early farming populations, evidence suggests dental problems increase, partly because carbohydrate-rich foods cling to teeth more readily than many earlier diets. Health patterns vary by region and period, and scholars still debate how universal these changes were, but the broad picture is complicated. Farming can support more people, yet individual health does not always improve immediately. The agricultural life is not automatically easier. It is more productive in one sense, but more demanding and sometimes more punishing in another. Density brings its own consequences. More people living together means more waste, more pests, more opportunities for infectious disease, and closer contact with animals. Stored grain attracts rodents. Human refuse attracts scavengers. Livestock bring dung, parasites, insects, and microbial risks. Water sources can be contaminated more easily when settlements grow and remain in place. Again, it is important not to imagine instant catastrophe. The great epidemic diseases of later history require large connected populations and long chains of transmission, but the village begins changing the ecology of illness. Human bodies, animal bodies, insects, waste, and water now meet in new patterns. One of farming's quietest legacies is that it makes humans more numerous, while also making them more exposed to the consequences of living close together. Yet the village also creates beauty, belonging, and symbolic depth. People decorate walls, shape figurines, polish stone, make beads, bury the dead with care, and build spaces that may hold ritual meaning. Agriculture does not reduce life to calories. In fact, as communities become more rooted, ritual may become even more important. Seasonal planting and harvest give time a cycle that can be marked, celebrated, feared, and explained. Animals become more than meat. Grain becomes more than food. Houses become more than shelters. A stored harvest can stand for security, generosity, status, or obligation. A successful herd can represent wealth and continuity. A field can become a family's memory made visible. The village is practical, but it is also imaginative. One lesser known but important detail is that early farming communities are often experimental in their architecture and social form. They do not all follow the same blueprint. Some settlements are small and dispersed. Others are surprisingly large. Some rely heavily on cereals, others more on animals, others on mixed strategies. Some use communal buildings or special structures, others emphasize households. Some remain occupied for long periods, while others shift, shrink, burn, or are abandoned. The early Neolithic world is not a ladder leading neatly from hut to village to town to city. It is a patchwork of attempts. Some succeed for centuries, some fail, some transform into new patterns, some leave only traces that are difficult to interpret. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is clear that people are testing not only crops and animals, but ways of living together. As villages grow, property begins to matter differently. Among mobile foragers, rights to places, tools, foods, and knowledge can be complex, but land is not usually fixed in the same way as later farming fields. Cultivation changes that. A planted plot contains labour invested before the reward appears. A house contains stored effort. A herd contains future animals not yet born. A granary contains a season held under protection. These things encourage claims. They also encourage memory of who worked, who shared, who inherited, who owed, and who controlled access. Inequality does not appear everywhere at once, and early villages may include strong sharing systems that limit accumulation. But the possibility of durable wealth has entered human life more deeply. Grain can be stored, animals can multiply, houses can persist, land can be improved. These are the quiet foundations of later hierarchy. The village also expands the meaning of community. More people can cooperate in building, harvesting, herding, defense, ritual, exchange, and care. Larger populations allow more specialized skills to develop, even before full-time specialists appear. Some people become especially skilled at tool-making, plastering, weaving, basketry, ritual performance, animal management, or plant processing. Exchange networks grow, carrying obsidian, shells, stones, pigments, ideas, and perhaps seeds across long distances. A village is rooted, but it is not isolated. In fact, settlement can make exchange more powerful, because a known place becomes easier to visit, revisit, and remember. The rooted community can become a node in a widening human web. By the time the village takes root, the old foraging world has not vanished, but its balance has shifted. Around the houses and storage pits, humans are no longer simply moving through abundance. They are producing it, defending it, depending on it, and organizing life around it. The village is a solution to uncertainty, but also a maker of new uncertainty. It creates more food, more people, more memory, more obligation, more disease risk, more social tension, more ritual, more invention. It is not civilization yet, but civilization is now possible in a way it was not before. The field feeds the village, and the village feeds the future, though no one standing in the dust of those first settlements can see how far that future will reach. Calling this transformation a revolution is useful only if the word is handled carefully. It was revolutionary in its consequences, but not in its tempo. The change that remade human history did not feel, to those living it, like a clean break from one age into another. There was no council where people agreed to leave the foraging world behind. There was no first farmer who understood that fields would one day make cities, kings, armies, writing, taxes, famine, empire, markets, and modern life possible. The people at the center of the change were making smaller decisions, most of them practical, local, and temporary. They were planting a little more seed because last year's patch had been useful. They were keeping animals closer because the herd was safer under watch. They were storing grain because the dry season was uncertain. They were staying longer because the houses, graves, tools, and food stores made return meaningful. The revolution, if it deserves that name, was a revolution without a plan. This is one of the most important corrections to the old story. For a long time, farming was often described as if it were an obvious improvement humans discovered agriculture. Food became more reliable, villages formed, civilization rose. But the evidence does not support such a simple ladder. In many regions, people lived for centuries or millennia in mixed economies that do not fit neat labels. They hunted and cultivated. They gathered wild plants and grew managed ones. They kept some animals while still relying on wild meat. They lived in settlements for part of the year or all of it, depending on local conditions. They used domestic crops without abandoning wild foods. They adopted animals without immediately adopting crop farming. They cultivated plants that remained biologically wild. What survives in the record suggests not a single leap, but a long middle ground. This middle ground matters because it reveals agriculture as a process of entanglement rather than invention. A tool does not need to be invented for the whole system to exist. A sickle, a grinding stone, a storage pit, a seed basket, a cleared patch, a tethered goat, a seasonal camp, a mud brick house, each one can exist before full agriculture. The transformation happens when these older and newer practices begin reinforcing one another. Storage makes staying easier. Staying makes cultivation more useful. Cultivation makes storage more necessary. Herding makes some landscapes more valuable. Larger settlements require more reliable food. More reliable food supports larger settlements. No single element explains the entire change. The system gathers itself slowly, like a net being tied knot by knot. The slowness can be difficult to imagine because later history trains us to look for decisive moments. A battle has a date, a king has a reign, a city may have a founding legend, but agriculture grows out of repeated acts whose beginnings are almost impossible to isolate. The first person who accidentally spilled seeds near a camp did not begin farming. The first person who noticed those seeds sprouting may not have either. The first deliberate planting may have been small, experimental, seasonal and easily abandoned. The first managed herd may have been partly wild, partly controlled, and understood differently by the people involved than by archaeologists thousands of years later. Scholars still debate where to draw the line between gathering and cultivation, between cultivation and domestication, between animal management and herding, because the ancient world does not obey modern categories. This is especially clear when the story widens beyond the Fertile Crescent. Southwest Asia is crucial, but it is not the whole beginning. In different parts of the world, people enter farming through different doors. In China, rice and millet follow distinct pathways shaped by river systems, monsoons, wetlands, loess landscapes, and regional traditions. In New Guinea, early cultivation may focus on vegetatively propagated plants such as tubers and bananas, leaving a record far less obvious than fields of grain. In Africa, sorghum, pearl millet, yams, oil palm, cattle, and other resources become part of diverse agricultural and pastoral histories, not one uniform package. In Mesoamerica, maize emerges from a long transformation of teosinte, joined by beans, squash, chili, and other plants in changing combinations. In the Andes, potatoes, quinoa, camelids, and highland adaptations shape a very different agricultural world. Farming begins many times, in many forms, under many pressures. There is no single human discovery that explains them all. Even within one broad region, the picture refuses simplicity. The classic list of early Southwest Asian founder crops is helpful because wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, flax, and related plants really are central to early farming there. But treating that list as a complete package can make the ancient world seem more orderly than it was. People also used wild fruits, nuts, small grasses, roots, leafy plants, and animals that never became domesticated. Some plants were cultivated briefly and then lost importance. Some weeds may have become companions of human disturbance before anyone considered them useful. Some crops moved into new regions and changed through contact with local practices. Bread wheat, for example, has a tangled history involving hybridization and regional movement, and newer finds in the South Caucasus remind us that even familiar crops can have unfamiliar chapters. The origin of farming is not one seed in one valley. It is a changing constellation. The same is true of how farming spreads. Sometimes crops, animals, and farming techniques move with migrating people. Ancient DNA has shown that in parts of Europe, the spread of farming is strongly tied to the movement of early farming populations from Anatolia and neighbouring regions, who mix in varying degrees with local hunter-gatherers. But this is not a universal rule. In parts of North Africa and the Sahara, pastoral lifeways can spread into communities with strong local ancestry, suggesting that ideas, animals, and practices sometimes move without large-scale population replacement. In some places, people adopt a crop but not the full farming lifestyle. In others, they adopt livestock and remain mobile. In others, newcomers and local foragers mix biologically, culturally, and economically. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Farming spreads through migration, imitation, exchange, marriage, pressure, opportunity, and desire, with different forces dominating in different places. This makes the agricultural revolution less like a torch passed from one hand to another and more like many fires catching in different materials. Some burn quickly, some smoulder, some go out, some flare again centuries later. A community may experiment with planting and then return to broader foraging. A crop may be introduced but remain minor for generations. A herd may become central in one landscape and useless in another. A wetland rice system cannot simply be copied into dry hills. A barley strategy suited to one climate may fail elsewhere. Every farming system must be translated into local ecology. The soil, rain, pests, daylight, animals, traditions, and social arrangements all decide whether the translation succeeds. The lack of a plan also means that many consequences were unintended. People seeking reliable food did not intend to create harder labour for future generations. People storing grain did not intend to create the foundations of inequality. People living with animals did not intend to open new pathways for disease. People staying near fields did not intend to make land a deeper source of conflict. Yet these consequences gather around agriculture because the system changes what can be accumulated, inherited, defended, and lost. The earliest cultivators are not foolish for failing to foresee this. No generation sees the full future of its own solutions. They solve the problems nearest to them, and history grows in the shadow of these solutions. By understanding agriculture as slow, diverse, and unplanned, the mystery becomes deeper rather than smaller. The old story of a sudden invention is dramatic, but it gives human beings too much clarity. The real story is more haunting. Across different continents, in different climates, with different plants and animals, people repeatedly discover that the living world can be nudged toward human need. They do this cautiously, experimentally, and often without surrendering older ways. Yet the nudges accumulate. The basket becomes the storehouse. The clearing becomes the field. The watched flock becomes the herd. The seasonal shelter becomes the village. The village becomes the world from which departure is harder. The revolution has no single inventor, because it is made by countless hands, most of them forgotten, all of them reaching toward the next season rather than the next civilization. The field promises security, but it never gives it freely. Every seed placed into the ground carries a bargain that early communities may only understand slowly. A harvested stand of wild grain belongs to a season already completed. A planted crop belongs to a future that can betray the people waiting for it. Rain may fail. Flood may come at the wrong time. Birds may descend. Insects may spread unseen. A fungus may ruin stored grain. Animals may break into a plot in a single night. People may work for months and still face hunger when the harvest disappoints. Farming creates more food across the long run, but it also creates a new kind of dependence on a smaller number of species, a smaller territory, and a narrower calendar. The wild landscape once offered many scattered chances. The field concentrates hope, and concentrated hope is always dangerous. This is the paradox at the heart of the agricultural revolution. Farming eventually supports more people than foraging over the same area of land. But it does not necessarily make each life easier. In many early agricultural communities, the work becomes heavier, more repetitive, and more tightly scheduled. The soil must be opened, whether by digging stick, hoe, or later plough. Seeds must be sown at the right time. Young plants must be protected. Weeds must be removed. Harvest must be gathered before it shatters, rots, dries too far, or is eaten. Grain must be threshed, winnowed, pounded, ground, cooked, and stored. Animals must be watched, moved, watered, and guarded. Houses need repair. Storage spaces need maintenance. Fuel must be collected from surroundings that become more depleted as settlements grow. A life once organized around many kinds of seasonal work becomes increasingly organized around the demands of a few central foods. The human body records some of this change. Archaeologists studying skeletons from different early farming populations often find signs that repeated agricultural labor leaves marks joint stress, spinal strain, changes linked to grinding grain for long hours, where from carrying loads, kneeling, digging, and repetitive movement. These patterns vary, and scholars still debate how sharply health changed in every region, because no single population can stand for all of humanity. But the broad picture is not the simple triumph once imagined. In some places, early farming communities show evidence of shorter stature, more dental disease, nutritional stress, and heavier workloads compared with earlier foragers. The details differ by diet, environment, social organization, and time period. Yet the warning is clear. More food in total does not automatically mean better health for every person. Diet is one reason. Foragers often eat a broad range of foods, depending on local ecology: meat, fish, shellfish, birds, eggs, nuts, fruits, roots, greens, seeds, honey, insects, and seasonal plants. Farming can narrow that range. A community leaning heavily on wheat, barley, rice, millet, maize, or tubers gains reliable calories. But calories not the same as nutritional breadth. A staple crop can fill stomachs while leaving gaps. Grain-rich diets can increase dental caries, especially when sticky carbohydrates remain on teeth. Stored foods can be contaminated by mold or pests. Dependence on a harvest can make bad years severe. The evidence remains incomplete and regionally varied, but the agricultural diet is not simply richer because it is produced. It can be abundant and monotonous at the same time. Settlement adds another cost. Larger, more permanent communities create new environments for disease. Waste accumulates near houses. Water sources are used repeatedly. Rodents, insects, and scavengers find opportunities around stored grain and refuse. Livestock bring people into closer contact with dung, parasites, and animal pathogens. Smoke from hearths can linger in enclosed spaces. Dense living increases the chance that infections pass from one body to another. It would be misleading to imagine the first villages immediately suffering the great epidemics of later cities and empires, because those diseases require large connected populations to persist. But the ecological foundations are being laid. Agriculture does not merely feed people, It changes the microbial world around them. The relationship with animals deepens this transformation. Sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, and later other domesticates provide meat, milk, hides, bone, horn, traction, manure, and social wealth. They also bring risk. Herds need pasture and water. They compete with crops and wild resources. They can damage fields. They can transmit parasites. They can become targets of theft or conflict. They can turn wealth into something visible and mobile, which means wealth can be counted, envied, raided, gifted, inherited, or lost. A small herd may begin as food security, but over time livestock can become a measure of status. The difference between families or households may widen. One group has more animals, more stored grain, better land, stronger alliances. Another has less. Inequality does not appear everywhere in the same way or at the same speed. But farming creates more durable forms of accumulation than many earlier ways of life. Land changes meaning as well. A foraging territory can be known, defended, shared, restricted, or ritually important. So it would be wrong to imagine that property begins only with farming. But cultivated land carries labour in a new visible form, a cleared plot, a tended field, an irrigation channel, a storage structure, a planted orchard, a herd route. These are investments that extend across seasons. Once labour is placed into the land, claims become harder and sharper. Who planted this field? Who may harvest it? Who controls the water? Who inherits the house? Who owns the stored seed? Who decides when grain is shared? These questions do not require writing to matter. They can be carried in custom, memory, kinship, obligation, and conflict. Later, states will turn such questions into law and taxation, but the roots are older than the first written tablets. Farming also changes population itself. More dependable calories can support more births and larger communities. Even if individual health is sometimes strained, population growth then increases pressure to produce more food, which encourages more fields, more labour, more settlement, and more dependence on farming. This cycle can become difficult to escape. A small foraging group can sometimes respond to scarcity by moving across wider landscape. A large farming village cannot move so easily, especially when houses, fields, graves, stores, and herds tie people to place. When population rises, the land around the settlement must carry more demand. Forests may be cut for fuel and building. Soils may be exhausted. Grazing may reduce vegetation. Wild animals may retreat. The village solves the problem of feeding more people, then creates the next problem by succeeding. Conflict enters this story carefully, because it would be too simple to say farming invents violence. Humans before agriculture were capable of cooperation and conflict, peace and rivalry, alliance and danger. But farming changes what conflict can be about. Stored grain, domestic animals, fixed land, water rights, and durable houses are things that can be seized, defended, inherited, or destroyed. As communities grow and resources become more concentrated, tensions can intensify. Some early settlements show signs of defensive placement, walls, crowding, or trauma in skeletal remains. Though the interpretation varies by site and period, scholars still debate how much agriculture increased organized conflict in different regions. Yet it is difficult to ignore that farming makes wealth more visible and territory more permanent. Where value gathers, danger often gathers with it. And still, the cost of grain does not mean farming was a mistake in any simple sense. It was a solution to real pressures. It allowed more people to live in one place. It made storage possible on a greater scale. It supported rituals, crafts, exchange, population growth, and eventually cities. It created landscapes of belonging and memory. Many communities did not experience farming only as burden. They also found meaning, abundance, identity, and beauty in the cycles of planting and harvest. And the field can be exhausting and sacred at once. A granary can be both security and temptation. A herd can be both wealth and worry. Human history rarely offers pure gifts. The deeper tragedy, if there is one, is that the bargain becomes clearer only after it is already binding. Each step seems reasonable. Plant a little more, store a little more, stay a little longer, keep more animals, clear another patch, feed more people, defend what has been built. Then one day, generations later, the community lives in a world where the old flexibility has faded. The grain must be planted because the village is too large to live without it. The herd must be watered because wealth now walks on hooves. The land must be held because too much labour has gone into it to walk away easily. Farming begins as a way to reduce uncertainty, but it creates a new form of dependence so powerful that much of human history will unfold inside it. The story does not remain in the hills and valleys of Southwest Asia. It cannot, because the beginning of farming is not one birthplace sending a finished idea to a waiting world. Southwest Asia is one of the great centres, and its wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and village traditions transform vast regions, especially as farming spreads into Anatolia, Europe, parts of North Africa, and beyond. But if the lens stays there too long, the human story becomes smaller than it really is. Across the planet, in different climates and with different plants, people find their own ways into cultivation, herding, storage, settlement, and dependence. Sometimes they borrow, sometimes they migrate, sometimes they experiment independently, sometimes they blend older foraging traditions with new crops or animals from elsewhere. The agricultural revolution is not a single flame. It is a constellation of fires, some close enough to light one another, some burning in distant darkness under different skies. In East Asia, the story follows both river water and dry earth. Along the Yangtze River and its wetlands, rice becomes one of humanity's most important crops, but it does not become domesticated through one clean step. Wild rice grows in watery landscapes where monsoons, lakes, marshes, floods, and human labour all matter. Early communities gather and manage rice in some places while still relying on wild forms in others. Over time, cultivation becomes more intensive. Tools change. Harvesting methods change. Water management becomes more deliberate. Eventually, paddy fields create a new kind of landscape, one in which humans do not simply plant a crop but engineer wet ground around it. The evidence remains incomplete and regionally uneven, but what survives suggests a long relay rather than a sudden invention. Different communities pass forward different pieces of the system until rice agriculture becomes one of the great foundations of Asian history. Farther north in China, millet follows a different path. Foxtail millet and broomcorn millet are plants of drier landscapes, suited to environments very unlike the wet rice fields of the south. They are small-seeded, hardy, and capable of growing where rainfall is less generous. Their domestication and spread help support early settled life in northern China, shaping diets, storage, and social organization in ways distinct from rice-growing communities. This matters because it shows that even within one broad region, agriculture is not one thing: a millet field, a rice paddy, a pig pen, a garden plot, and a riverine foraging camp all create different rhythms of life. The people who move between them are not following a universal agricultural script. They're adapting the living world to particular soils, seasons, and social needs. In New Guinea, the story becomes harder to see because the plants themselves leave fewer obvious traces. Highland New Guinea is one of the most important regions for early cultivation, yet its agricultural beginnings do not centre on wheat, barley, or rice. Instead, people manage and cultivate plants such as taro, yams, bananas, and other vegetatively propagated crops. These plants do not always produce durable seeds that char and survive conveniently for archaeologists. Their cultivation may rely on cuttings, tubers, drainage, mounding, digging, transplanting, and careful management of wet ground. The archaeology of such crops is subtle traces of ancient ditches, disturbed soils, microscopic plant remains, and changes in landscape use. For a long time, this made grain-centered regions seem more important simply because their evidence was easier to find. Scholars still debate many details of timing and development, but New Guinea reminds us that the origin of agriculture cannot be understood only by looking for cereals. In Africa, farming and herding unfold across an enormous range of environments, from the Nile Valley to the Sahel, from West African forests to the Ethiopian highlands and the once greener Sahara. The Sahara itself is one of the most haunting landscapes in this story because it has not always been the desert familiar today. During humid periods after the Ice Age, parts of it hold lakes, grasslands, animals, and human communities. Pastoralism spreads through this changing world, especially cattle herding, and the movement of animals, people, and ideas is complex. In some areas, herding seems to spread with limited genetic replacement, suggesting that local groups adopt livestock and pastoral practices without being swept away by large migrating populations. In other areas, migration and mixture play a larger role. No single explanation fully accounts for the African Neolithic, because Africa does not offer one path. It offers many cattle, sorghum, pearl millet, yams, oil palm, teff, enset, and regional traditions shaped by climate, mobility, exchange, and resilience. The western edge of North Africa adds another layer. Ancient DNA has shown that the arrival of Neolithic lifeways there can involve people moving from Iberia and later connections with the Levant, while other areas preserve strong local forager ancestry even as herding or farming practices appear. This contrast is important because it prevents the story from becoming too neat. Farming sometimes travels with people, sometimes it travels as knowledge, sometimes animals move before crops, sometimes crops move before people fully change their lifeway. Sometimes local communities adopt new practices quickly because those practices fit existing needs. Sometimes they resist, modify, or ignore them. The spread of agriculture is not only a biological process of ancestry, and not only a cultural process of imitation, it is both, unevenly mixed. In Mesoamerica, the agricultural story centers on one of the most dramatic plant transformations in history maize. Its wild ancestor, teosinte, does not look like the corn that later feeds cities and empires. Teosinte has small, hard, encased seeds, and the transformation into maize requires long selection across many generations. Early cultivators do not begin with a plant that obviously promises vast fields. They begin with something more modest, more local, more experimental. Over time, human preference reshapes the plant larger ears, exposed kernels, increased productivity, forms better suited to harvest and storage. But maize does not stand alone. Squash, beans, chili peppers, avocado, amaranth, and other plants become part of changing food systems. The famous triad of maize, beans, and squash becomes powerful later, but its development is long and regionally varied. As elsewhere, agriculture grows through combination, not a single crop in isolation. In the Andes, farming climbs into altitude. Potatoes, quinoa, and other highland crops become central in environments where cold nights, steep slopes, and thin air shape every decision. Camelids such as llamas and alpacas become essential partners, providing transport, fiber, meat, dung for fuel and fertilizer, and social value. Here agriculture is not about imitating the river valleys of Southwest Asia or the rice wetlands of China. It is about making life possible in vertical landscapes where ecological zones are stacked by elevation. Communities can move goods between highlands, valleys, and coasts, linking potatoes, maize, fish, cotton, camelids, and ritual economies into complex systems. The Andes show how agriculture can become not merely a way to grow food, but a way to connect worlds separated by height. Across Europe, farming spreads in a different pattern, strongly shaped by migration from Anatolia and southeastern Europe. Ancient DNA has revealed that early farmers moved into the continent and mixed in varying degrees with local hunter-gatherers. The spread is not simply local foragers deciding to copy a new method. In many places, people carrying farming ancestry, crops, animals, and village traditions physically move across landscapes, following river corridors, coastlines, and fertile soils. Yet even here, the story is not simple replacement. Local hunter-gatherers persist, interact, exchange, intermarry, and influence later populations. Some regions adopt farming quickly, others remain foraging for long periods. Some landscapes are easier for the farming package to enter than others. The map of Europe becomes a slow negotiation between movement, land, climate, and human contact. By widening the story beyond the Fertile Crescent, the agricultural revolution becomes more human, not less. It shows that people everywhere are solving related problems with different materials. How can food be made more reliable? How can abundance be stored? How can plants be encouraged to return? How can animals be kept near without destroying the balance of life? How much should a community stay, move, borrow, risk, or change? The answers vary because the world varies. Wheat does not teach the same lessons as rice. A goat does not create the same society as a llama. A wetland does not demand the same work as a dry plateau. A tuber garden does not leave the same trace as a barley field. And yet, across all these differences, the same deep pattern appears. Humans begin drawing the future closer by binding themselves to other species. The field, wherever it appears, is never only soil and seed. It is a local answer to the ancient problem of tomorrow. The deeper the story of farming reaches into the past, the more it depends on evidence that is small, damaged, scattered, and often accidental. A city wall can be mapped, a written tablet can be read, if the script is known. A royal tomb announces itself with stone, gold, and architecture. But the beginning of agriculture is usually hidden in things that look almost ordinary: a charred seed, a polished edge on a flint blade, a patch of ancient soil, a storage pit filled with dust, a grinding stone worn smooth by hands no one remembers. The great transformation that eventually leads to kingdoms and empires begins in traces so fragile that they survive only when fire, mud, dryness, waterlogging, or burial happens to protect them. Much of the evidence is not preserved because people meant to preserve it. It survives because something was dropped, burned, forgotten, flooded, sealed, or abandoned. This makes the archaeology of early farming both powerful and frustrating. Charred seeds are among the most important clues. When plant remains are burned in low oxygen conditions, they can carbonize rather than vanish completely. Thousands of years later, archaeologists may recover them from hearths, floors, pits, middens, or collapsed buildings. Under magnification, a seed can sometimes reveal its species, whether it belongs to wild or domesticated forms, and how it fits into a broader pattern of plant use. A change in the proportion of non-shattering cereal remains, for example, can suggest domestication. Larger seed size may hint at selection, though interpretation is not always straightforward. A few seeds alone rarely prove farming, but when many plant remains appear alongside tools, storage, settlement, and landscape change, they begin to form an argument. The seed becomes a witness, but it must be questioned carefully. Grinding stones speak in a different way. Their worn surfaces show repeated processing, but not always exactly what was processed. Grain, nuts, pigments, roots, and other materials can all pass over stone. Residue analysis may recover starch grains, phytoliths, proteins, or microscopic plant fragments, but preservation varies. Sometimes the stone tells a clear story of plant processing. Sometimes it only tells us that labour happened there again and again. That is still important. A heavy grinding slab in a repeatedly used settlement suggests investment in place and food processing. A tool with sickle gloss suggests repeated cutting of silica-rich stems, often cereals or reeds. A storage pit suggests planning beyond the immediate meal. Each clue is partial. Together, they form a pattern of routine, and routine is where agriculture hides. Phytoliths are another kind of ghost. These tiny silica bodies form inside many plants, and after the plant decays, they can remain in soil for long periods. In some cases, phytoliths help identify rice, grasses, palms, or other plants even when seeds are absent. Starch grains can cling to tools, pottery, dental calculus, or sediment, carrying hints of what people processed and ate. Pollen can reveal changes in vegetation, though it can travel by wind and water, complicating interpretation. Ancient soil chemistry can show burning, dung, cultivation, trampling, or settlement activity. Animal bones can reveal herd management through age and sex profiles, size changes, butchery marks, and movement into new regions. Isotopes in human and animal bones can suggest diet, mobility, and environmental conditions. Ancient DNA can trace ancestry, migration, domestication, and mixture in ways earlier generations of archaeologists could barely imagine. Yet every method has limits. The evidence remains incomplete, and sometimes the most honest answer is that several explanations remain possible. Ancient DNA has transformed the story of farming spread. It can show whether new lifeways moved mainly through migrating people, through local adoption, or through mixture. In Europe, genetic evidence has made clear that early farming spread largely with people whose ancestry connects back toward Anatolia and neighbouring regions, though they mixed with local hunter-gatherers in varied ways. In parts of North Africa, the picture can look different. With strong local ancestry continuing even as pastoral or farming lifeways appear, in livestock, DNA reveals tangled histories. Sheep, cattle, pigs, and goats do not always descend from one neat founding population, but often from mosaics of wild ancestry, regional mixing, and later movement. In plants, Genetics can show relationships among wild and cultivated forms, revealing hybridization, bottlenecks, dispersals, and long histories of selection. DNA has not made the old mystery disappear. It has made it more precise and in some ways more complicated. One reason the evidence is so difficult is that domestication is not a single visible object. A stone tool is made in a moment, though it may be used for years. A house is built in a season. But domestication is a population-level change across generations. It lives in shifting frequencies of traits: a tougher seed head here, a larger grain there, a calmer animal, a different horn shape, a altered body size, a changed coat, a new tolerance for human-controlled breeding. Early cultivation can happen before clear domestication. Animal management can happen before bones look fully domestic. A community can eat domesticated grain and still depend heavily on wild foods. Another can grow wild-type plants in managed plots. This is why archaeologists must resist the temptation to label a site too quickly. Farming is not proven by one seed, one blade, one house, or one animal bone. It emerges from convergence. There are also absences that distort the picture. Cereals preserve better than many tubers. Burned grain can survive beautifully. A yam garden may leave almost nothing obvious. A rice field may leave phytoliths and water management traces. A banana grove may be far more elusive. Wooden tools, baskets, mats, digging sticks, fences, cordage, and plant fiber containers usually vanish. The beginning of agriculture may therefore be biased toward what archaeology can see most easily. This bias once made certain regions seem more central, and certain crops seem more important than they may have been in lived experience. Scholars still debate how many early plant management systems remain under-recognized because their crops were archaeologically shy. This silence of the record is not the same as absence in the past. Another difficulty is that early farming practices could appear and disappear. Archaeology often preserves lines of development as if they were inevitable, but human experiments fail. A group might cultivate a plant for a few generations and abandon it when climate changes. Soils weaken, pests increase, or social life shifts. A settlement might grow and then disperse. A crop might arrive from another region and remain minor for centuries before becoming important. A herd might be managed locally and then replaced by animals from another population. These reversals can be hard to detect, especially if evidence is thin. The past was not a clean staircase. It was full of trials, interruptions, and forgotten alternatives. And yet, from this broken record, a remarkable picture has emerged. The old idea of one sudden agricultural revolution has given way to a slower, stranger, richer story. Charred seeds show changing plants. Grinding stones show repeated labor. Sickle blades show harvest. Storage pits show planning. Houses show attachment. Animal bones show management. Isotopes show diet and movement. DNA shows ancestry and mixture. Pollen and phytoliths show changing landscapes. No single clue is enough. But together they reveal a world where people and other species become entangled step by step. The mystery is not that evidence is lacking. The mystery is that from such tiny remains, an entire human transformation can be reconstructed at all. So the beginning of farming is not written in a single monument. It is written in burnt crumbs, broken tools, worn teeth, old bones, microscopic silica, and seeds blackened by fires that went out 10,000 years ago. It is a history preserved not by kings, but by accidents. A meal burns, a pit collapses, a house floor is sealed, a field leaves a chemical shadow, A skeleton keeps the memory of diet in its bones. The first farmers do not leave us a declaration. They leave us residue. And from that residue, slowly and imperfectly, the shape of a new world appears. Long before the first city rises, the conditions for cities are being prepared in fields, storehouses, paths, and village courtyards. The city is not hidden inside a seed in any mystical sense, yet the seed makes certain futures possible. A community that can produce more food than it immediately eats can support more people in one place. A village that can store grain through lean months can survive shortages that would have scattered a more fragile settlement. A household that can tend fields and animals across seasons begins to accumulate not only food, but obligations, claims, and memory. Slowly, the landscape fills with investments that cannot easily move: wells, terraces, irrigation channels, burial places, storage rooms, paths between settlements, and fields changed by years of work. Once that happens, human life is no longer organized only around where food can be found. It is organized around where food has been made to return. Population growth is one of the most powerful consequences. Farming can be hard, unhealthy in some ways, and risky, but it allows more people to live from a given area than most foraging systems can support over the long term. More food supports more births, and more people require more food. The cycle tightens. A village grows from a handful of houses to dozens, then perhaps hundreds. Nearby land is cleared more intensively. Animals graze farther from the settlement. Wood for fuel and building must be carried from greater distances. Paths become roads of habit. Neighbouring communities become more aware of one another because their fields, herds, marriages, exchanges, and disputes now overlap. What survives in the record suggests that growth is uneven. Some settlements expand dramatically, others remain small, others are abandoned, but the possibility of density has changed, and density is one of the deep foundations of history. With density comes specialization, slowly at first. In a small community, most people must know many tasks. They farm, gather, tend animals, repair houses, make tools, cook, carry, store, and remember. But when food production becomes more dependable and communities larger, some skills can receive more time. A person especially good at shaping stone blades may make more than one household needs. Another may become known for plastering floors, weaving baskets, making ornaments, tending animals. Brewing, healing, organizing rituals, or arranging exchange. These are not yet the full-time professions of later cities, and scholars still debate how specialized early village economies really were. But a threshold is approaching. Food surplus, even if modest, allows some labor to move away from immediate subsistence. Civilization does not begin with kings. It begins when not every hand must be on the harvest at every moment. Exchange networks widen the horizon. Farming villages are rooted, but they are not isolated. Obsidian travels from volcanic sources across surprising distances. Marine shells appear far inland. Fine stone, pigments, beads, and symbolic objects move between communities. Seeds and animals move too, though often in ways harder to trace. Exchange is not merely trade in the later market sense. It can be gift, alliance, marriage connection, ritual obligation, seasonal meeting, or shared identity. A farmer may need stone from a distant source. A herder may need grain from a village. These movements create webs of dependency and knowledge, because fixed communities need what their local landscapes cannot provide. Storage is the quiet engine beneath many of these changes, A basket of grain is food. A room of grain is power waiting to happen. Stored surplus can feed workers during construction, support feasts, help a community endure scarcity, or strengthen leaders who control distribution. At first, storage may be household-based, communal, or mixed in ways that remain difficult to interpret archaeologically. Some early settlements show storage inside houses, suggesting household control. Others have larger or more centralized facilities, hinting at broader organization. The evidence remains incomplete, and storage does not automatically equal hierarchy. Many communities may have used sharing systems to prevent any one person or group from becoming too powerful. But once food can be accumulated in durable form, it can also be counted, guarded, displayed, redistributed, and withheld. Those possibilities shape everything that follows. Ritual and authority grow alongside food production, not simply after it. In early agricultural communities, special buildings, symbolic objects, burials, figurines, painted walls, animal installations, and carefully prepared spaces suggest that people are investing enormous energy and meaning. The famous monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, which belong to a world before fully developed farming, remind us that ritual complexity does not wait for agriculture in a simple sequence. Yet as farming villages expand, ritual can become tied more closely to seasonal cycles, harvests, ancestors, land, fertility, herd protection, and the legitimacy of people who organize communal life. A person or group that can coordinate planting, feasting, storage, labor, or ceremony may gain influence. Authority may begin as service, memory, charisma, ritual knowledge, or generosity before it hardens into rank. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of hierarchy. But agriculture gives hierarchy new materials to work with surplus, land, inheritance, and dependence. Irrigation is another step toward more complex organization. Not all early farming depends on irrigation, and many successful agricultural systems are rain-fed. But where water must be directed, stored, drained, or shared, cooperation and conflict both intensify. A small canal requires labor. A larger system requires timing, maintenance, rules, and trust. Who opens the channel? Who repairs the breach? Who receives water first in a dry year? Such questions can be solved locally and fairly. But they can also become sources of authority in river valleys such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, and parts of China. Water management will eventually become linked to large settlements and states, though the relationship is never as simple as irrigation automatically creating government. Writing, when it eventually appears, is not born from poetry first. In several early states, it is deeply tied to accounting, administration, offerings, labor, land, animals, and grain. The first marks that lead toward written bureaucracy often arise from the need to remember what the human mind alone can no longer hold: reliably quantities, deliveries, debts, rations, ownership, temple goods, taxes, herds, fields. Farming does not directly create writing, but it creates the kind of stored, distributed, counted world in which writing becomes useful. A granary asks to be remembered, a herd asks to be numbered, a labor force asks to be organized. The tablet, in a sense, grows from the storehouse. From villages, then towns, then cities, the consequences of agriculture become enormous. Urban life requires food produced beyond the city itself. Farmers, herders, fishers, gardeners, and laborers feed people who may never sow a field. Temples rise because surplus can support builders, priests, craft specialists, and administrators. Armies become possible because food can be collected and redistributed. States emerge because land, labour, water, and surplus become things that can be managed at scale, though also contested at scale. And yet the path is not inevitable. Farming does not automatically produce cities. Many farming societies remain village-based for millennia. Some communities resist central authority, collapse, reorganize, or return to smaller scales. Scholars still debate why cities appear in some agricultural worlds and not others, because the answer involves environment, population, trade, conflict, ideology, technology, and contingency. By the time the first cities finally rise, they can seem like a new species of place walls, streets, temples, workshops, granaries, markets, administrators, strangers, noise, smoke, ceremony, and inequality crowded together. But beneath them lies the older village, and beneath the village lies the field, and beneath the field lies the long memory of wild plants gathered by people who did not know they were preparing the future. The city is not the opposite of the seed. It is one of the seed's distant consequences. In every early granary, in every stored harvest, in every canal cut into mud, in every path worn between settlements, the soil is already holding the outline of the urban world to come. The field that begins as a small answer to uncertainty eventually becomes the ground beneath nearly everything humans recognize as history. It changes diets, settlements, labour, bodies, landscapes, animals, plants, gods, governments, property, trade, migration, disease, inequality, and memory. It changes not because farming is one thing, but because it touches so many things at once. A crop is biology, but it is also time. A herd is animal life, but it is also wealth. A granary is storage, but it is also power. A village is shelter, but it is also inheritance. Once humans bind themselves to domesticated species, they begin living inside a web of obligations that reaches far beyond hunger. The seed must be saved. The field must be tended. The water must be watched. The animals must be moved. The harvest must be stored. The next season must be imagined before it arrives. Over thousands of years, this web spreads across continents and sinks into the earth itself. Forests are cleared. Grasslands are grazed, wetlands are drained or reshaped, hillsides are terraced, rivers are diverted, soils are enriched, exhausted, revived, and exhausted again. Plants once confined to small wild ranges travel across the world. Wheat leaves its ancestral landscapes and becomes a global food. Rice transforms river basins and wet fields across Asia and beyond. Maize crosses oceans after millennia in the Americas and remakes diets on continents its earliest cultivators never saw. Potatoes leave the Andes and later feed vast populations far away. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and other animals move with humans into environments where their wild ancestors never lived. The modern world's fields are therefore also maps of ancient journeys. But farming's legacy is not only abundance, it carries the old bargain forward. Agriculture allows billions of people to live, but it also creates dependence at a planetary scale. A disease in a crop, a drought across a grain belt, a failure of water, a shift in climate, a conflict over land, a broken supply chain. These are modern problems, yet their roots reach back to the first stored seeds and watched herds. The ancient desire to make food more reliable never disappears. It becomes irrigation, storage, breeding, trade, markets, fertilizers, machines, satellites, genetic science, and global shipping. Still, beneath all that complexity lies the same basic vulnerability: humans remain dependent on plants, animals, soil, rain, sunlight, and timing. The oldest uncertainty has not been defeated, it has been organized. The domesticated species carry their own strange legacy. They are some of the most successful organisms on Earth, not because they conquered the planet alone, but because they entered human life: wheat, rice, maize, barley, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens now exist in numbers and ranges that would have been impossible without people. Yet their success comes with dependence. Many domesticated crops cannot easily survive without human sowing, harvesting, protection, and storage. Many domestic animals live in forms shaped so deeply by selection that their bodies are historical documents. Humans change them, and they change humans in return. Our teeth, bones, genes, gut microbes, work habits, settlement patterns, and social systems all carry echoes of the agricultural turn. Even the ability of many adults to digest milk in some populations is a legacy of long relationships with dairy animals, though its spread varies by region and history. The body itself remembers the herd. Farming also changes how humans imagine ownership and time. A planted field encourages a claim that stretches into the future. A stored harvest becomes a season held in reserve. A breeding herd becomes wealth not only now, but in offspring not yet born. A house beside fields becomes a center of memory. From these changes grow inheritance, boundary, debt, rent, tribute, taxation, and eventually the administrative world of states. Not every farming society follows the same path, and scholars still debate why hierarchy deepens in some regions while other communities maintain more equal arrangements for long periods. But the possibility of durable accumulation is one of agriculture's most powerful consequences. It allows generosity on new scales, and domination on new scales. It feeds festivals and armies, temples and households, cities and empires. The landscape of belief changes too. Farming communities often live by cycles that can be watched with hope and fear: sowing, sprouting, flowering, harvest, birth, milk, drought, flood, blight, return. The earth becomes not simply a place to move through, but a partner whose moods matter. Ancestors may be tied to houses and fields. Rituals may follow the grain. Animals may become offerings, symbols, companions of gods, measures of wealth, and signs of cosmic order. The sky itself becomes an agricultural instrument, because seasons must be tracked. Calendars, ceremonies, monuments, and myths grow around the need to know when to plant, when to move herds, when rains should come, when rivers rise. The field turns time into something sacred and practical at once. And yet, the older world never fully vanishes. Foragers continue beside farmers for thousands of years. Herders move between settled and unsettled worlds. Fishers, traders, gardeners, nomads, villagers, and townspeople exchange foods, tools, stories, genes, and customs. Agriculture does not erase human diversity. It reorganizes it. Some communities adopt crops but keep older mobility. Some take animals but not fields. Some resist farming for long periods because local foraging remains successful. Some combine strategies so well that modern categories become clumsy. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to imagine every person marching in one direction toward the plough. Human history is not a single road from wilderness to civilization. It is a landscape of choices, pressures, accidents, and adaptations, many of them lost from view. Still, the pull of farming becomes immense. Once populations grow around crops and animals, stepping away becomes difficult. The village needs the harvest. The town needs the village. The city needs the countryside. The state needs the grain. The empire needs the tax. The market needs the shipment. The modern kitchen, however far removed from the first fields, still depends on domestications begun by people who had no word for agriculture and no vision of the world their habits would create. A loaf of bread, a bowl of rice, a cornfield, a cup of milk, a sheep's wool garment, a potato lifted from dark soil, each is a quiet survivor of ancient experiments. So the agricultural revolution changed human history not because it was sudden, and not because it was simple, but because it was cumulative. It gathered force from countless small acts repeated until they became a world. Someone returned to a valley. Someone cut wild grain. Someone saved seed. Someone cleared a patch. Someone watched a young animal instead of hunting it. Someone stored food for a season that had not yet come. Someone repaired a house because leaving was no longer easy. None of them had to know they were remaking humanity. The field did not need a founder, it needed repetition, and over time, repetition became destiny. The story ends, not at the first farm, and not even at the first city, but in the quiet recognition that human history is often made by changes too slow to feel while they are happening. A seed is small enough to vanish between fingers. A basket of grain can look ordinary beside a hearth. A goat watched near a settlement can seem like a practical choice, nothing more. Yet time gathers around such things. Generations pass. The patch becomes a plot. The plot becomes a field. The field becomes a boundary. The boundary becomes a memory, then a claim, then a law, then a kingdom's concern. Behind every ancient city, there is soil. Behind every written tablet, there is something counted. Behind every temple offering, every ration, every stored harvest, every road carrying food towards strangers, there is the older human wish to make tomorrow less frightening than today. Farming never fully grants that wish. It answers uncertainty with another form of uncertainty. It gives abundance, but asks for labour. It gives settlement, but asks for dependence. It gives memory, but asks people to remain close to the places that hold it. And still, there is something deeply human in the beginning of it. Not conquest, not sudden genius, not a single heroic invention, but attention. People watching grasses sway in dry wind. People learning the moods of water. People remembering where a plant grew thick after fire. People saving what was good. People returning because return had become meaningful. Across thousands of years, the living world changed under their hands, and they changed with it. The first farmers are gone beyond naming. Their houses are dust, their baskets vanished, their songs unreachable. But the species they touched remain everywhere. They rise in fields, fill bowls, graze hillsides, cross oceans, feed cities, and wait in storage for seasons not yet born. The ancient fire has gone out, but somewhere in the ash, a seed survived, and from that small, patient thing, much of the human world began.